George Herbert Walker Bush was an American politician, diplomat, and businessman who served as the 41st President of the United States from 1989 to 1993. A member of the Republican Party, he also served as the 43rd Vice President from 1981 to 1989 under Ronald Reagan and previously in various other federal positions. Born into a wealthy, established family in Milton, Massachusetts, Bush was raised in Greenwich, Connecticut. He attended Phillips Academy and served as a pilot in the United States Navy Reserve during World War II before graduating from Yale and moving to West Texas, where he established a successful oil company. Following an unsuccessful run for the United States Senate in 1964, he was elected to represent Texas's 7th Congressional District in 1966. President Richard Nixon appointed Bush as the ambassador to the United Nations in 1971 and as chairman of the Republican National Committee in 1973. President Gerald Ford appointed him as the chief of the liaison office to the People's Republic of China in 1974 and as the director of Central Intelligence in 1976. Bush ran for president in 1980 but was defeated in the Republican presidential primaries by Reagan, who then selected Bush as his vice presidential running mate. In the 1988 presidential election, Bush defeated Democrat Michael Dukakis. Foreign policy drove Bush's presidency as he navigated the final years of the Cold War and played a key role in the reunification of Germany. He presided over the invasion of Panama and the Gulf War, ending the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait in the latter conflict. Though the agreement was not ratified until after he left office, Bush negotiated and signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, which created a trade bloc consisting of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Domestically, Bush reneged on a 1988 campaign promise by enacting legislation to raise taxes to justify reducing the budget deficit. He championed and signed 3 pieces of bipartisan legislation in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Immigration Act and the Clean Air Act amendments. He also appointed David Souter and Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. Bush lost the 1992 presidential election to Democrat Bill Clinton following an economic recession, his turnaround on his tax promise, and the decreased emphasis of foreign policy in a post-Cold War political climate. After leaving office in 1993, Bush was active in humanitarian activities, often working alongside Clinton. With the victory of his son, George W. Bush, in the 2000 presidential election, the two became the second father-son pair to serve as the nation's president, following John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Another son, Jeb Bush, unsuccessfully sought the Republican presidential nomination in the 2016 primaries. Historians generally rank Bush as an above-average president. After graduating from Yale, Bush moved his young family to West Texas. Biographer John Meacham writes that Bush's relocation to Texas allowed him to move out of the daily shadow of his Wall Street father and grandfather Walker, 2 dominant figures in the financial world, but would still allow Bush to call on their connections if he needed to raise capital. His first position in Texas was an oil field equipment salesman for Dresser Industries, which was led by family friend Neil Mallon. While working for Dresser, Bush lived in various places with his family: Odessa, Texas, Ventura, Bakersfield, and Compton, California, and Midland, Texas. In 1952, he volunteered for the successful presidential campaign of Republican candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower. That same year, his father won election to represent Connecticut in the United States Senate as a member of the Republican Party. With support from Mallon and Bush's uncle, George Herbert Walker Jr., Bush and John Overby launched the Bush-Overby Oil Development Company in 1951. In 1953, he co-founded the Zapata Petroleum Corporation, an oil company that drilled in the Permian Basin in Texas. In 1954, he was named president of the Zapata Offshore Company, a subsidiary which specialized in offshore drilling. Shortly after the subsidiary became independent in 1959, Bush moved the company and his family from Midland to Houston. There, he befriended James Baker, a prominent attorney who later became an important political ally. Bush remained involved with Zapata until the mid-1960s, when he sold his stock in the company for approximately $1 million. In 1988, The Nation published an article alleging that Bush worked as an operative of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, during the 1960s. Bush denied this claim. George H. W. Bush's tenure as the 41st President of the United States began with his inauguration on January 20, 1989, and ended on January 20, 1993. Bush, a Republican from Texas and the incumbent vice president for 2 terms under President Ronald Reagan, took office following his landslide victory over Democratic nominee Michael Dukakis in the 1988 presidential election. His presidency ended following his defeat in the 1992 presidential election to Democrat Bill Clinton, after 1 term in office. Bush was the father of the 43rd president, George W. Bush. International affairs drove the Bush presidency, which navigated the end of the Cold War and a new era of U.S. Soviet relations. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, Bush successfully pushed for the reunification of Germany in close cooperation with West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, overcoming the reluctance of Gorbachev. He also led an international coalition of countries which invaded and defeated Iraq after it invaded Kuwait in the Gulf War. On a smaller scale, he directed a military invasion to overthrow a dictator in Panama. Bush signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, which created a trilateral trade bloc consisting of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. In domestic affairs, Bush faced a large federal budget deficit. Despite insisting he was pledged to not raise taxes, Bush agreed to a budget with the Democratic-controlled Congress that raised taxes and cut spending. In the aftermath of Allied victory in the Gulf War, Bush was widely considered likely to win re-election, but Clinton defeated Bush with third-party candidate Ross Perot taking a large chunk of the electorate. Despite his defeat, Bush left office with a 56% job approval rating, and he remained popular with the public until his death in 2018. In polls of historians and political scientists, George H.W. Bush is generally ranked as an above-average president. Bush was widely seen as a pragmatic caretaker president who lacked a unified and compelling long-term theme in his efforts. A Bush soundbite, referring to the issue of overarching purpose as the vision thing, has become a metonym applied to other political figures accused of similar difficulties. His ability to gain broad international support for the Gulf War and the war's result were seen as both a diplomatic and military triumph, rousing bipartisan approval, though his decision to withdraw without removing Saddam Hussein left mixed feelings, and attention returned to the domestic front and a souring economy. A New York Times article mistakenly depicted Bush as being surprised to see a supermarket barcode reader. The report of his reaction exacerbated the notion that he was out of touch. Bush was popular throughout most of his presidency. After the Gulf War concluded in February 1991, his approval rating saw a high of 89%, before gradually declining for the rest of the year, and eventually falling below 50% according to a January 1992 Gallup poll. His sudden drop in his favorability was likely due to the early 1990s recession, which shifted his image from conquering hero to politician befuddled by economic matters. At the elite level, several commentators and political experts lamented the state of American politics in 1991 to 1992 and reported the voters were angry. Many analysts blamed the poor quality of national election campaigns. After leaving office, Bush and his wife built a retirement house in the community of West Oaks, Houston. He established a presidential office within the Park Laureate building on Memorial Drive in Houston. He also frequently spent time at his vacation home in Kennebunkport, took annual cruises in Greece, went on fishing trips in Florida, and visited the Bohemian Club in Northern California. He declined to serve on corporate boards but delivered numerous paid speeches and was an advisor to the Carlyle Group, a private equity firm. He never published his memoirs, but he and Brent Scowcroft co-wrote A World Transformed, a 1998 work on foreign policy. Portions of his letters and his diary were later published as The China Diary of George H. W. Bush and All the Best, George Bush. During a 1993 visit to Kuwait, Bush was targeted in an assassination plot directed by the Iraqi intelligence service. President Clinton retaliated when he ordered the firing of 23 cruise missiles at Iraqi intelligence service headquarters in Baghdad. Bush did not publicly comment on the assassination attempt or the missile strike, but privately spoke with Clinton shortly before the strike took place. In the 1994 gubernatorial elections, his sons George W. and Jeb concurrently ran for governor of Texas and governor of Florida. Concerning their political careers, he advised them both that at some point both of you may want to say, well, I don't agree with my dad on that point, or frankly I think dad was wrong on that. Do it. Chart your own course, not just on the issues but on defining yourselves. George W. won his race against Ann Richards while Jeb lost to Lawton Chiles. After the results came in, the elder Bush told ABC, I have very mixed emotions. Proud father, is the way I would sum it all up. Jeb would again run for governor of Florida in 1998 and win at the same time that his brother George W. won re-election in Texas. It marked the second time in United States history that a pair of brothers served simultaneously as governors. Bush supported his son's candidacy in the 2000 presidential election but did not actively campaign in the election and did not deliver a speech at the 2000 Republican National Convention. George W. Bush defeated Al Gore in the 2000 election and was re-elected in 2004. Bush and his son thus became the second father-son pair to each serve as President of the United States, following John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Through previous administrations, the elder Bush had ubiquitously been known as George Bush or President Bush, but following his son's election, the need to distinguish between them has made retronymic forms such as George H. W. Bush and George Bush Sr. and colloquialisms such as Bush 41 and Bush the Elder more common. Bush advised his son on some personnel choices, approving of the selection of Dick Cheney as running mate and the retention of George Tenet as CIA director. However, he was not consulted on all appointments, including that of his old rival, Donald Rumsfeld, as Secretary of Defense. Though he avoided giving unsolicited advice to his son, Bush and his son also discussed some policy matters, especially regarding national security issues. In his retirement, Bush used the public spotlight to support various charities. Despite earlier political differences with Bill Clinton, the two former presidents eventually became friends. They appeared together in television ads, encouraging aid for victims of the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami and Hurricane Katrina. However, when interviewed by John Meacham, Bush criticized Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and even his son George W. Bush for their handling of foreign policy after the September 11 attacks. Bush supported Republican John McCain in the 2008 presidential election and Republican Mitt Romney in the 2012 presidential election, but both were defeated by Democrat Barack Obama. In 2011, Obama awarded Bush with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. Bush supported his son Jeb's bid in the 2016 Republican primaries. Jeb Bush's campaign struggled, however, and he withdrew from the race during the primaries. Neither George H. W. nor George W. Bush endorsed the eventual Republican nominee, Donald Trump. All three Bushes emerged as frequent critics of Trump's policies and speaking style, while Trump frequently criticized George W. Bush's presidency. George H. W. later said he voted for the Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, in the general election. After the election, Bush wrote a letter to President-elect Donald Trump in January 2017 to inform him that because of his poor health, he would not be able to attend Trump's inauguration on January 20. He gave him his best wishes. In August 2017, after the violence at Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, both Presidents Bush released a joint statement saying, "America must always reject racial bigotry, anti-Semitism, and hatred in all forms. As we pray for Charlottesville, we are all reminded of the fundamental truths recorded by that city's most prominent citizen in the Declaration of Independence, We are all created equal and endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights. On April 17, 2018, Barbara Bush died at the age of 92 at her home in Houston, Texas. Her funeral was held at St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Houston 4 days later. Bush, along with former Presidents Barack Obama, George W. Bush, son, Bill Clinton, and First Ladies Melania Trump, Michelle Obama, Laura Bush, daughter-in-law, and Hillary Clinton attended the funeral and posed together for a photo as a sign of unity. On November 1, 2018, Bush went to the polls to vote early in the midterm elections. This would be his final public appearance. After a long battle with vascular Parkinson's disease, Bush died at his home in Houston on November 30, 2018, at the age of 94. At the time of his death he was the longest-lived U.S. president, a distinction now held by Jimmy Carter. He was also the third oldest vice president. Bush lay in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol from December 3 through December 5. He was the 12th U.S. president to be accorded this honor. Then, on December 5, Bush's casket was transferred from the Capitol Rotunda to Washington National Cathedral where a state funeral was held. After the funeral, Bush's body was transported to George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas, where he was buried next to his wife Barbara and daughter Robin. At the funeral, former President George W. Bush eulogized his father saying, "He looked for the good in each person, and he usually found it." In May 1991, the New York Times revealed that Bush had developed Graves' disease, a non-contagious thyroid condition that his wife Barbara also had. Bush had 2 separate hip replacement surgeries in 2000 and 2007. Thereafter, Bush started to experience weakness in his legs, which was attributed to vascular Parkinsonism, a form of Parkinson's disease. He progressively developed problems walking, initially needing a walking stick for mobility aid before he eventually came to rely on a wheelchair from 2011 onwards. Bush was a lifelong Episcopalian and a member of St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Houston. As president, Bush regularly attended services at St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. He cited various moments in his life on the deepening of his faith, including his escape from Japanese forces in 1944, and the death of his 3-year-old daughter Robin in 1953. His faith was reflected in his 1,000 Points of Light speech, his support for prayer in schools, and his support for the pro-life movement, following his election as vice president. Shortly after his death, it was revealed that Bush secretly financed the education and food expenses of a schoolboy from the Philippines under the assumed name George Walker through the charity Compassion International. Thank you for watching this video.